doing today?
I'm doing good, thank you. How are you, Toby?
I'm doing really well, thank you. Hey, so thanks for joining us. I love having authors on of books I'll review because I get to start by just asking you to describe the book for my listeners. If they're sitting in the bookstore and they see it, pick it up, what could they expect?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's a father-son story at its heart and at its core, but there's a big historical and political backdrop to the story, and that's what makes it a little different. It's all true. It's everything in it was very detailed and researched and backed up by court documents, FBI documents, and literally 2 decades worth of research or more, and interviews that I did with actual people who were involved with my father. Now, who is my father? So, my father's name was Sam Melville, and he's been footnoted in several dozen books about the 1960s and domestic terrorism. Depending on what your political viewpoint is, he's either a terrorist or a freedom fighter. And mostly what he did was protest the U.S. involvement in Vietnam and general U.S. imperialism around the world. He was raised as a communist and a Marxist. His father, my grandfather, was a leader in the Communist Labor Party in America, and kind of raised my father with a Marxist philosophy. And in his adult life, my father adopted this Marxist philosophy and took it to what some might call extremes, and used explosives and his knowledge of architecture, because he was an engineer. He was a plumbing engineer for a very prestigious engineering firm, and worked on the plumbing designs for Lincoln Center. Everyone knows Lincoln Center in New York, Brooklyn Borough Hall, and other government buildings. So he had knowledge of these buildings, and he combined his knowledge of these buildings with what he would call the appropriate pacifist attitude, and decided to bomb these buildings to protest what he felt was horrendous U.S. imperialism. Now, it's important, I think, for your readers to understand and differentiate between my father's brand of terrorism and what we have come to associate today with Islamic extremism, or what some have called white supremacy extremism, those forms of terrorism. And there's a huge difference. My father chose his targets for their political significance, and he made sure to use his knowledge of engineering to make sure that no one was killed or injured in his bombings. That's the opposite of how other extremists and other terrorists today operate, whereas they choose their targets based on convenience and accessibility, and they choose the time and methodology to cause the most amount of collateral human damage. So there's an enormous difference between those two. I think it's important in your audience, because I know throughout this interview they're going to be judging me and my father, and I get that, and they're entitled to that, but understand that he was at heart a pacifist and never intended to hurt anybody.
Yep, exactly. And I'm glad you said that, because there's so many modern day hooks that we can talk about to sort of what you described in your father. I was wondering, so there was obviously a ton. So two things. Number one, when I pick up a book that I don't really know that the subject matter, right? Your father's name did not ring a bell with me. I wasn't sure what I was getting into. But what I love about books like this is it was interesting enough for me to take a look. And because I took a look, I learned a lot. Like, I didn't know anything about Attica. I didn't know anything about any of this stuff. And it forced me to at least several, half a dozen Google searches in the first part of the book. And I think
Good.
that's really cool for parents, because we're so busy just kind of getting our kids through school and getting things done, that we typically aren't going out and learning new things anymore, because we're just so keyed up on what our little ones are learning. So I appreciated you doing that. And then number two, there was obviously tons of thoughtful research done to get this book together, because you really didn't have a relationship with your father per se growing up. So it wasn't like these are firsthand accounts. You had to go chase these people who were characterized as hippie extremists back in the 60s and try to figure out, like, piece together the story, right?
Yes, I did have a relationship with my father, but it was short-lived. And then through correspondence after he was captured and in prison. But you're right. Essentially, to really learn about who my father was, I had to play an enormous game of catch-up.
Mm-hmm.
And the version of events that my mother told me when I was 11 years old, didn't match the reality of what I'd been eventually, as I got older and read about him in papers and and in other people's books about the 60s. I'm like, this doesn't match. My mother told me that he was led astray by crazed hippies. That doesn't sound like this guy I'm reading about here, who is considered, an activist and a leader and an organizer, and someone who was much more proactive than just someone who kind of went along for the ride and got swept up in the times. And the more I did research, the more I realized that my father was actually not a victim of the times, but in many ways defined them, and defined the promise of 60s activism and what they called liberalism back then, which is very different from liberalism today. And so, yes, I had to play a lot of catch up. The government had a lot of information that they were unwilling to give me. It took me many, many, many years to get documents that in theory I was entitled to as a citizen through something called the Freedom of Information Act, which means anyone, you, me, anyone, can write a letter to the Department of Justice and say, I want all the files you have on this person. And if those files are declassified, you're entitled to them for free. But it doesn't really work out that way. You actually, they'll send you documents that are heavily redacted to the point where there's almost no useful information in them. And you'll wait months or years to get those. Then you'll have to sue and to get them to unredact them. And that can take more years. Reverse engineering the names that were behind those redactions and then requesting those people's files. I got those files, and then I was able to kind of create like a jigsaw puzzle of redacted documents until I had one document that was no longer redacted. And then from there you can continue. And then I also, over the years, one of the things the Freedom of Information Act, one of the things that the Department of Justice will do is if you request documents that someone else already requested, and those documents are previously prepared for you, you'll get them much quicker. So I went through all the New York Times articles of all the journalists had written about them. I said, well, just give me everything you gave the New York Times, give me everything you gave to this author, give me everything you gave to that author. And so that kind of shortcutted a lot of it. But that also took over a decade because people had to write about my father and request those documents before I could request the documents they requested.
That's crazy. Well, I read your acknowledgments where you said, I can't remember the person's name, but gave you the idea to write the book in '87. And then you do touch on, pitching it to Simon Schuster and the evolution of how we got to today, this published work, American Time Bomb. So I figured, by the way, you're doing all this work, and that's just to figure out how to talk to people, right? And then you have to actually make the cold call and meet them and take the notes, scribe the notes. I mean, it's wild how much research you would have done with this. How long did this take you to put together? 20, 30 years or something?
Yep. I started working on the project in 1987. And I finished my research. My research is truly never finished because I'm still getting letters from people saying, well, you could change this fact. This could be more accurate. Everybody thinks they have a monopoly on the truth. And of course, there can only be one author. And the author has to kind of cherry pick which truths are going to tell the story that makes the most sense to him or her. And since this was initially or ultimately a father-son story, I had to keep the focus on, how did this affect me personally? And one of the reasons it took me so long to write this book was not because of facts, but because I couldn't really write a book about my father until I became a father, until I really understood what's the sacrifice involved in, leaving your family and going off on a political cause that is eventually going to get you arrested or killed. How do you reconcile that? And for years, when I was a child and I was being taken around to these radical or leftist fundraisers and interesting things that people who knew my father, I guess my research really began when I was 12, from the day I found out about it. And I started asking people at various things around New York, and they would say, oh, your father was a hero. You should be so proud to be his son. And these are all people who were venerated in the New York political left movement. So, of course, I wanted to believe them when they told me this. But in my mind, what I was thinking was, well, how should I feel about a man who wanted to change the world but abandoned his only child to do it?
Yeah, you allude to that late in the book, and that was the question that kept burning in my mind. Is like, did you approach this as researching my dad, who to me felt like a deadbeat? And I'm using that word, I'm throwing that word around a little bit. Or am I researching him in the context of history? Because history on the leftist side obviously paints him in a different way. And you, as the guy who just wants a dad, would think about him differently. So I imagine that juxtaposition was tough to figure out what approach to take.
It was. And I realized that I have to tell both a personal story and a historical story. And then I had to decide, now really, who's my audience for this? And now we're kind of getting off into, behind the scenes author talk, but I'll be brief about it. You can't just write from the heart entirely. You have to figure out who your audience is going to be. Otherwise, you'll end up writing for nobody except yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to decide, did I want to write a book for baby boomers who lived through these events? And I thought, yeah, there's value in that. I mean, but they'll probably buy the book anyway if they knew who my father was. And so I decided my real audience is millennials and Gen Z, and to some degree, generation Gen X, who barely remember these incidents.
Yeah, and I mean, and you think about the turmoil of today. Slowly post-pandemic, Black Lives Matter. All these different things going on, which to me, even as a Gen Xer, seem to be a little bit newer. But to somebody like that lived through the 60s and 70s, I know my dad always talks about, hey, it's just kind of a reincarnation of the boiling pot that's been simmering in America for a while. So it might be pretty timely for that generation to understand the historical context of what they might believe in today, right?
Yes. And in fact, millennials today, percentage-wise, make up a larger portion of the U.S. population than baby boomers did in the 60s and 70s. Most people don't know that, but it's an enormous group of people. They have an enormously powerful voice, and they are, I would say, in many ways, just as angry at the government as hippies and baby boomers were in the 60s and 70s for different reasons, but just as angry. And, rather than protests and marches, they have the internet and Twitter. And, in some ways that's good. It democratizes a number of things, but in some ways it's also way too pacifying because, you feel angry about something, you write a tweet, but that's not really going to change anything, but you feel better. You think that, you have 8,000 followers or 8,000 people care what you say, but, probably they don't.
Yeah. Well, one thing bringing this back to fatherhood or parenthood, those are the people that are listening to me now. The books, American Time Bomb is the book, guys, and the subtitle is Atticus, Sam Melville, and a Son's Search for Answers. So Joshua Melville, the author, whose father is chronicled in the book. So did you find answers that you were looking for, or did you know the answers what answers were you trying to find, and did you find them?
Sure, thank you. Well, I wanted to find out whether or not, like many people on the left I spoke to, said he was assassinated. I wanted to determine if that was true or not. I did get an answer to that. And I wanted to find out how active he really was. Was he just a passive guy who was along for the ride, or was he for real? And then personally, was he a true believer, or was he just a deadbeat dad who found a fashionable outlet for his rage? And that was a big question for me. And in talking to a lot of radicals, ex-radicals, I discovered that a lot of these people, and I think it's true even for a lot of the Antifa members is probably the wrong word, but people who are involved in Antifa or BLM or any kind of movement that involves violence against property or people, most of these individuals are probably, if there wasn't a fashionable outlet for their rage, they would be angry anyway, and they would do many of these things anyway. So in a lot of ways, a movement kind of creates a veneer of legitimacy for violent, disruptive actions. And I don't think I approve of that. In fact, I know I don't. And so I don't agree with my father's choices even back then, but I do respect his conviction, and I do respect the message that he was trying to send. And of course, I respect him and I love him, but I'm also angry at him at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I have one last question for you, and I'll get back to, so you said, I guess I'll interpret what you said about having children forced you to kind of push the book forward and really complete the project, even though it was a labor of love. So how has your experience, not only in researching your father, but having lived through some of it, the relationship you had with your father, how has that influenced the way you parent?
Enormously. One of the things that I think I said earlier, I don't remember, was that I couldn't write this book until I became a father myself. That created the final piece of the puzzle for my perspective, because you can't write without perspective, otherwise it's a stream of consciousness. So the perspective of the book, which is heavily it's kind of hidden. You don't really get it until you get to the end and say, "Ah, okay, now I see where he's going with this." Is the real revolution in our country is not destroying buildings and or bombing things or even protesting. It's being a decent parent. You want to change the world? Raise a productive child, raise them with good values, and that's the big lesson that I took away from this. Is I think of all the things my father missed out on because of the choices he made that led to his incarceration and his death that were inevitable. He could have made different choices. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he would argue, I had to make these choices. That's who I am. But I don't know. He was a really, really strong-willed individual. I think he could have done anything he wanted to do. And I certainly was tempted in my 20s and 30s to kind of follow in his footsteps, be my father's son. And then I really realized that having a family is what I wanted to do. And when I look at both of my kids, they're both incredible, beautiful kids. And, my daughter, she's interested in law enforcement, ironically. And, I know he's either turning over in his grave or laughing hysterically because he did have a very sardonic sense of humor. To me, that is the real revolution. Yeah. I look at my son, and he's only 17. He's never known a world without a black president, but he really doesn't understand the sacrifices that were made by people like my father to get us to this point, the point where that can be something that we just almost take for granted, or And so being able to give him that perspective, to help him understand that this is not a black and white world. Things aren't extreme. There's a lot of gray in the middle. And you have to learn to understand the nuances of life in order to make the most effective choices for yourself. That's what this project ultimately taught me as a parent.
Love it. I love it. It's funny you say that I remember the quote now where you said raise a good person, or raise good kids or something. And then he followed it up. That kind of got me. I kind of was like, oh man, this is going to hit me. A picture, I think it was you playing catch with your son, and you said, my grandfather didn't play catch with my dad, or my father.
My grandfather didn't play catch with my father. My father never played catch with me. Things can change.
Yeah, it was quite lovely, and a good bow on the whole thing, especially from a dad who endeavors to do the same, but may lose that in the deck of cards you're playing every day. So
I hope people get to that last page and just pick up the phone and feel the need to call their parents. That was really my purpose of that. Our parents aren't perfect people, and one of the hardest things about being a child is learning to accept the fact that your parents are human and forgive them for making their mistakes. So I've definitely forgiven my father for making his mistakes. I even, forgave the person who killed him, who I found out who that person was, and learned a lot about them too. They were just doing what they thought was best for their child. And ultimately, as parents, that's what we end up spending our time doing. And the line I think I use in the book at the end of that section is the crimes we commit for our children. And that's what it really takes to be a parent.
Yeah, you really said it best, at the heart. So again, guys, go pick up American Time Bomb, Atticus, Sam Melville, and a Son's Search for Answers. He is Joshua Melville, the author, and I appreciate you spending the time with us. In passing, I just want to say that, not only did I learn a bunch, it forced me to go actively learn a bunch, which I appreciate. And secondly, you said it exactly correctly. It's really a father-son story, and an unconventional way that a son shouldn't really deliberately have to go research their father like this. They should know their father. But the fact that you did is a tribute to the story that you tell. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I mentioned American Time Bomb is the hub website for it.
Okay.
They can read about me, and there's also many links to many different ways to buy the book. It is on audio as well, and a lot of reviews are posted there as well.